Welcome, everyone, to the Florida Historic Capitol Museum. I am delighted to be broadcasting live with you this evening for Historic Preservation Month. We're joined tonight by special guests from Connecticut's Old State House, and tonight we're going to spend some time together sharing these wonderful historic spaces here at the Historic Capitol and in Connecticut. For those of you who have participated in a Rotunda Rendezvous, and you know each year we this is a well much for part is events time is learning
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint program with our friends in Florida. We're really excited to have you with us. Unfortunately, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so we're going to get started with this part of the program. My name is Rebecca Tabor. I'm the head of public programs here at Connecticut's Old State House, and we're very happy to be able to welcome you to this special program today. And we would encourage everyone to fill out the survey that will be posted in the comments. And so we hope to get your feedback on that. But we're really excited to be the first partnering with our friends in Florida. And so it's great to have you all with us today. So I'm going to get the program started and share a little bit about our museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. We encourage people to come and visit us. We're getting ready this summer to reopen with obviously certain restrictions in place, but we hope you'll come see us this summer very soon. So I'm going to ask for my slides to be brought up, and we'll get started sharing our museum with us. There we go. So you'll hear a couple of names this evening. We work at Connecticut's Old State House. We are part of the Connecticut Democracy Center. And so we also have other initiatives under that umbrella. And so tonight I'd really like to focus on the Old State House. It's kind of a perfect time, if you could go to our next slide, Allie. It's a perfect time to talk about the Old State House because this week is our birthday week. 225 years ago, we opened for business. And so it's a perfect time to celebrate Historic Preservation Month. One of the things that's been really interesting in talking to our colleagues in Florida has been discovering some of the similarities between our buildings' shared experience. Our building here in Hartford dates to 1796. It is a National Historic Landmark, but the space we're on is a very historic one. And it actually is, this building that we're in right now is the fourth building that has existed in this space. And we're going to share a little bit about the story of how we came to be and how our building came to be saved. As Tiffany mentioned, May is Historic Preservation Month. And so it really is a great time to talk about our building. Okay, we'll go on to the next one, Allie. So as I mentioned, this is the fourth building at this site. The first two buildings were meeting houses because, and I should start off by saying that prior to European settlement, obviously this area was settled by Native Americans, including the Pequot tribe. There were two meeting houses shortly after settlers led by Thomas Hooker came to this area, and one was a very early log kind of structure and then replaced by a 1640 meeting house. This meeting house was built on high ground. We're on a little bit of a hill and overlooking the Connecticut River. And the meeting house was used for a variety of uses, including both secular and religious. Well, as things got started with the colony of Connecticut, a new building was needed. And so we moved in 1720, the first state house was constructed. And if you want to bring up the next slide, Allie. So the first state house was constructed in 1720. This was used, and I should pause to say, sometimes when visitors come to see us, they're rather amused because here in Connecticut, which is, of course, one of the smaller states in the United States, we had two capitals here in Connecticut because the Connecticut colony started originally, and then there was the New Haven colony, and eventually those colonies came together. But it was kind of a political deal, I think, in that there were two capitals. And so it started off first, it was a seasonal change, and then it became an every other year thing. So we had two capitals cities here in Connecticut, and we were one of them. And so this state house that you see pictured was constructed in 1720. And so it would go every other year. Well, this building that you see was actually damaged by fire in 1783. The story goes that perhaps one of someone coming into the building had been a little worse for the wear, celebrating the end of the American Revolution. The building caught on fire. It was severely damaged. The building was repaired, though, and able to be used again. But and this is going to be a common refrain to what my presentation has today, and that is the fact that they needed more space. And so members of the government really started thinking about the need for additional space and the need for a new state house here in Hartford. And of course, in this time, by the 1780s, of course, now we weren't a colony, we were the state of Connecticut, since it was post-revolution. And another refrain that you will hear perhaps in our colleague's presentation as well, and you'll hear a lot just in terms of history, which is it was hard to get funding. So originally what happened was that, and we can move to the next slide, Allie, the financing for the building that we're in right now came from a variety of sources. Donations poured in, or I don't know if poured is the right word, but some donations did come in, including Jeremiah Wadsworth, who lived down the street here on Main Street. Money that was gifted from the city and the county of Hartford, along with state funds, garnered close to $14,000. But that wasn't enough. So the state tried a lottery, which at the time was a very popular way of raising money. Well, the lottery was pretty near, so that didn't raise enough. So the gentleman who was pictured in this portrait, Jeremiah Halsey, and his colleague, Andrew Ward, proposed to the state of Connecticut that they would get the job done if they got the money from the lottery and they were given this piece of land called the Gore. And that was just a narrow sliver of land between New York and Pennsylvania that Connecticut claimed. Now, that was a kind of tenuous claim, but the state of Connecticut agreed to this. And the deal was that Halsey and Ward would get this land if they got the project done in 2 years. Because construction had already started, it was getting delayed. And so Halsey and Ward, they organized a company and they sold shares to this land. And they got the job done. The building was completed in 1796. The only problem, though, was that the gore was then deemed to not belong to Connecticut. So that really left Halsey, because Ward had already had disappeared from the scene by then. Halsey was kind of left holding the bag a little bit in terms of having to pay for the project. He was eventually reimbursed for the money he spent, but not really reimbursed for his time. What you see, the image that you see, is a portrait of Jeremiah Halsey, and it was painted by Joseph Stewart. And we're going to talk about Mr. Stewart because he's very closely connected to Connecticut's old State House. But what's really cool about this picture is look closely. Look closely in the background, in that little window. And what you will see there, and if you want to go ahead, Allie, to the next slide, what you will see there is one of the earliest known images of Connecticut's old State House. And if you look very closely, you can, if you think back in your mind to what the original image was as to what you see now, or what you see here, I should say, it's rather different. First of all, you'll notice that there's no cupola. There's just a hip roof that you see. The fence is also different. It's a white fence. And one thing I should mention is the fact that, and you'll see a picture a little bit later that shows it a little bit more. If you come to Hartford to see our building, you'll notice that one side of the building faces Main Street and the other faces this lawn area. And the lawn area, the east side of the building, was the original front of the building because that's what faced the Connecticut River. A lot of people were traveling by river, by water, and it was the building, as I mentioned before, with the meeting house, it was on a hill, so you would approach from the river. So it gave a sense of grandeur as you were approaching to the State House. A couple of interesting things to mention about our building. The architect for the building is believed to be Charles Bulfinch, who is a little bit more famous for his role in designing the Boston State House. There's some evidence based on a letter, some other evidence that suggests that Bulfinch's first public commission was our building, which is pretty neat. And then the other thing to mention is that our building housed all three branches of government, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But as you're looking at the building in this image, to the left, and I should start off by saying that the brick, the building is made out of brick and brownstone. The brownstone comes from Portland, Connecticut. But you'll see kind of that arcade with the arches that was open to the elements in 1796. So it was kind of a breezeway. There was a staircase in that center area. And to the left on the first floor belonged kind of executive-based offices, although not the governor didn't have an office until later, and we'll talk about that in a second. He actually didn't get an office till 20 years after the building was completed. To the right was a courtroom. And so this building was known to many people as the court, not just the State House, but the courthouse. And then on the second floor were the legislative chambers, what served as the House chamber. And then what became the Senate, originally was housed the Governor's Council. And then on the third floor were additional offices and committee rooms that were also used by other folks as well, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is the oldest known image of our building. And we're going to move ahead now into the 1830s. And, you know, like all buildings change over time when they're being used. Think about your own home and the changes you make. And so now we've moved to an image that dates from the 1830s. You can already see a few things that are different. The building has been painted white. I always call this, and this is my own view, and is that in the 1830s, this building was Greekified because as it was first constructed, it was very much a classical style federal building with brick. It was very restrained in ornamentation, but styles change. And so by the first quarter of the 1800s, Greek revival became all the style because Greece was a country to emulate because they had a history of democracy. So rather than rebuild the State House, which had been a really expensive prospect, it was updated and modified. And so you can see that it's been painted. You can also see a few other changes that were made. A balustrade, which is really just kind of a fancy word for that kind of fence on the top, was added along with urns. And then a cupola, again, a fancy term for a tower. And we have a clock tower and a statue of justice. And so those were the changes made. And you can also see the other thing that's kind of cool when you come to visit us, which is we still kind of have the same footprint. That lawn on the east side is pretty much the same size and shape as it was in this image. And we have a reproduction fence based on this image. So if we could go to our next slide, you can see a close-up of some of the details that were added in the 1820s. So this just shows a close-up of our cupola, which was restored a few years ago. We'll talk about that, and regilded, and also the Statue of Justice that was on top of the building. It originally faced east, so towards the river, because of course, as I mentioned, that's the front of our building. The original Statue of Justice was brought inside in the 1970s because she's actually made out of wood, and for those of us who live in New England and get to enjoy the freeze-thaw experience that we go through every winter, she was a little worse than for the wear. And so she was brought inside. And so those were the changes that were made to our building in the course of the first quarter of the 19th century. Now, as time progressed, you will find complaints from legislators over the building is too small, we need more space. And then another debate was going on. And that debate had to do with the fact that it was really getting expensive to move the Capitol every other year because you had to pack up everything. So debate was going on about choosing one Capitol for the state of Connecticut. Hartford put in a bid. They offered to help pay for the building, and it went to vote. And in 1873, Hartford was named the sole capital. That took effect in a couple years later, and so this building served as the sole state capital for 3 years. And we're going to move ahead, and we're going to talk about our current state capital, because of course more space was needed, and so Richard Upjohn was selected to be the architect for what is our current state capital. The General Assembly approved plans for this building, very high Gothic, expressive, exuberant building. And so what happened to our building at that time is that in 1878, we went through a period of renovation for about a year in preparation for the state capitol to become City Hall. And if you want to move ahead to that slide. So I'm not going to go through all the changes because there were a number of them, but one of the most important changes was they painted the building again. You can't see it because this isn't colorized, but it was attractive shades of mustard yellow and brown, perhaps, bless the Victorians and their color schemes. And one of the other big changes was in the courtroom. The courtroom was basically chopped up to provide office space. And so like the governor's office became the mayor's office. And one of the things that you might notice in this image is that this image was taken from Main Street. And what you'll see is where that beautiful lawn was, there is now this Second Empire building right behind it. And that was a new post office. And we'll get a close-up of that. So what you see here is a post office that was added and completed in 1882. The fence was removed at that time. And not only was it a post office, it served as the U.S. District Court for several years. And as soon as the building became City Hall, there were already calls for the fact that they needed more space for City Hall. So this is when we hit the part of the story where the future of the old State House, or what we call now the old State House, became iffy. And, I think one of the really strong stories of the preservation of Connecticut's old State House has to do with civic action and people caring about the space and caring about keeping it. And one of those people was Emily Holcomb. So Emily Seymour Goodwin Holcomb was really important in the saving of this building. As far back as 1905, the Municipal Art Society published a letter saying that you need to save the State House, the old State House. By 1911, kind of the using this building as the City Hall was really deemed obsolete. There was talk about a need for a new City Hall. And Emily Holcomb, on behalf of the Society of Colonial Dames, pledged $10,000 towards saving this building. Around the same time, the Hartford Courant, our local newspaper, ran an essay for kids on why we needed to save the State House. And, at this time, there was discussion about truly just pulling down the old State House, using this building for something else. And it really brought together a lot of civic and patriotic organizations from all over Hartford who wanted to save this building. And so, and one of the real issues, and so I should say that a new City Hall was constructed. It was partially paid for by a native son of Hartford, J.P. Morgan. And so that opened in 1915. So the question became, what do you do with this building? And so if you take a look at our next slide, you'll see that during World War I, and this is from World War II, but during World War I, the building was used to sell Liberty loans. It was used for meetings, and war bonds were sold here, public restrooms, historical exhibitions. But the building was in pretty tough shape, and still its future was uncertain. And then a former governor of Connecticut named Morgan Buckley got involved. And he got involved in 1970. He pledged $5,000, and he said that he would get 10 other people to pledge the same amount in 2 weeks. They were called the Bullfinch 10. And they helped provide the money to save this building. So the first restoration of Connecticut's old State House took place during this period. There was a new slate roof added, structural steel for the roof and the floors, colonial revival woodwork for the halls and courtroom, because remember the courtroom had been turned into offices, and new staircases for the building. Well, still the question really was, what do you use this building for? It was used for meetings. As I said, war bonds were sold here, public restrooms, historical exhibitions. But what would the purpose of this building be? And if you take a look at this beautiful image, it's a postcard from the 1930s and circa the 1930s, you can see what downtown Hartford looked at that time. Moving ahead to the 1950s, it was at that time that in 1959 that the city of Hartford came to an agreement with Connecticut Historical Society. And they signed an agreement that the building would be owned and maintained by the city, but managed by the Connecticut Historical Society. And this image is particularly fun to look at because those of you who are familiar with the Isle of Safety, which used to exist here. Well, that arrangement worked pretty well until 1975. And let's guess what happened at that point. Well, the building was in danger again because in 1975, the city eliminated funds in their budget for this building. So at that point, the building was once again under threat. to either be turned into a restaurant or torn down to use as a parking lot. And again, people stepped up and stepped in to help. Bill Foudy, who is pictured here, the late Bill Foudy, was instrumental in rallying people to help form the Old State House Historical Society. And they raised ultimately $12 million to restore the Old State House. A museum was formed here in the 1970s. The restoration, of course, it took a lot of time to raise that much money. The restoration took place between 1991. The building reopened on its 200th anniversary, which was 1996. And it was what you see here, and I know I'm running a little over, so I'm gonna try to wrap it up quickly. But what happened, and we're gonna talk a little bit about how this building was restored, but you see a great picture of Bill in front of the Old State House. At this point, the building was restored to what it looks like today. And so I wanna kind of take you on a quick tour of what you'll see when you come to visit us. So the House of Representatives chamber was restored to more of a Victorian era feel, and really kind of the period of transition between the building being the State House to becoming City Hall. So this does have a very mid to late 19th century feel. The desks and chairs that you see there date to the 1870s. There were a whole bunch of different styles, and if you go to the current state capitol, you'll see similar ones there. Moving, and if you look back to the back of, we just looked at the dais side of the building. If you turn around and look at the back, you'll see that this room was always meant to be open to we the people, because there is a balcony there. If you traipse across the hall to the Senate chamber, you'll see that this room was really restored to the federal style with the exuberant yellow. This particular room has changed its purpose because here in Connecticut, initially the governor of Connecticut had very little power. They truly were almost ceremonial and really didn't have the power of veto until the new state constitution of 1818. And it was in 1820 when they finally got their office in the building. But one of the things I love about the Senate chamber is this wonderful original portrait of George Washington, which was done by Gilbert Stuart. And the portrait really was done as a memorial to President Washington. He died in 1799, and this was hung in the Senate chamber in 1802. And this is the Lansdowne version of Gilbert Stuart portrait. And moving to our next slide, you can see something that was added very early in our history, which was the Cabinet of Curiosities. Remember that picture we looked at, that portrait we looked at of Jeremiah Halsey? Well, it was done by a man named Joseph Stewart. And Joseph Stewart asked for permission shortly after the building was opened to first open a painting gallery, because he made his living as a painter, but then to open a Cabinet of Curiosities. And so as part of that restoration with Bill Foudy, this was done, this recreation of Stewart's Museum was done. Originally, it was on the 3rd floor. Today, it's on the 2nd floor. But luckily, Stewart had published what you could come and see in his museum. So that made it very handy for doing a restoration. And then on the 1st floor was located the courtroom. We don't have time to talk about it tonight, but one of the most famous cases that was heard here was one of the hearings having to do with the Amistad trial. And this space was it's very much a colonial revival space because it had been so impacted by the changes of the building when this building became City Hall. So, and this is where normally we do our public programs when we're able to be together. And then we're gonna pop over to the governor's office. This space was carved out of what was the treasurer's office originally. What you see now today is obviously not what it looked like in 1820, but it's a modern recreation because here at Connecticut's Old State House, we have a number of signature programs, including the Connecticut Kid Governor program. And so this is where the Office of the Kid Governor is located. And I should mention, to kind of bring you to present day, so the Old State House Historical Association cared for the building for a number of decades, and until 2002, when the Connecticut Historical Society again became stewards of this building. And in 2008, the Connecticut General Assembly made an arrangement, an agreement after putting the contract out to bid with the organization that we work with, the Connecticut Democracy Center. And so we assumed stewardship for this building in 2009. And I should say we run the public programs and school programs here. The state of Connecticut cares for this building. And in that time, and moving ahead with that, in that time, just now it seems like yesterday, but it was actually 5 years ago in 2016, the state of Connecticut funded the restoration of the cupola and the gold dome and the Statue of Justice. At that point, when they were doing the work, the gilt was really holding on by a hair's breadth because it was so compromised. So they restored that. And as some of these changes have gone forward, people have come in. We had some other repair work done over the years. And in our work today at Connecticut's Old State House, moving on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, I work for the Connecticut Democracy Center. And so we have worked in this building since 2008, 2009. And we do a lot of things here. We do school groups. You can see one of our students participating in our 3 branches of state government program. Actually, 2 pictures of students. And also we do public programs in our courtroom. So there's a lot of life here. We hope you'll come to see us soon and look forward to welcoming you in person. So I know I went a little bit over my time. My apologies to my colleagues. I think those of us who love history, we get so excited about our buildings, and there's so many stories we could tell. So I'm going to hand it back over to Tiffany, and I look forward to learning about the State House in Florida.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I definitely understand being super excited about your building and having to figure out how to cut the story down. I think that's the great thing about tonight's tours, is that it's really a teaser. So what we're trying to do is introduce you to these special spaces and hoping that you'll come back and join us for a bit more. I'm in the House chamber now here at the Historic Capitol. And as you can see behind me, we also have a portrait of George Washington. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later in some conversation. So I'm just going to get into my PowerPoint as well, so that we can, get back to chatting with each other and getting into the really fun stuff. So the first thing that you see tonight on my PowerPoint is the Historic Capitol Museum as it looks today. It's been restored to its 1902 appearance. And behind us, if you can see in the background, is a tower structure, and that is actually our working Capitol. So we were the working Capitol for about 130 years, and then a decision was made to build a new building. And I'll tell you more about that as we go through the slides. But very similar stories, I think you'll find tonight as I give the history of our building and as we kind of chat together between the Connecticut State House and the Historic Capitol. And so I think that capitals in general, which going to my next slide. Okay. Let me just make sure that it will do it. Okay. On my next slide that you should see is a collection, actually, of all of the 50 working capitals. And we love to use this particular image in our building, not only for exhibit purposes, but for connection purposes with visitors. I don't know about you, but there have been many, many people who feel an affinity for buildings that look like this, that have a dome. Not in every instance. There are, 4 capitals that are tower capitals. But there is a feeling, I think, when individuals see structures like this with columns and domes that invoke a sense of civic participation. And so we like to share these structures and just kind of chat with the visitors about why they feel compelled to visit them, for example, on a 50 capital quest. And so I just wanted to show that. So in this slide, you see what is actually the first 2 sort of capitals that were here in Tallahassee. And so what you'll see is a log cabin structure. It's hand-hewn logs, kind of an impermanent capital structure that was part of territorial, Florida. And then on the other slide, you see a slightly more permanent structure, also kind of in process. Essentially, it looks like a building maybe that might be added onto, and that was really the plan originally for that structure. But by the time it was the 1830s and Florida was starting to transition to becoming a state, which they would in 1845, the residents of Tallahassee, the leaders in the territory at the time, went to the federal government and said, what we have in Tallahassee is simply inadequate as a government structure. And so what we need to do is to receive, hopefully, a congressional appropriation to help us build a more permanent structure. And they did receive an initial appropriation of $20,000 in 1838. They completed part of the very first Capitol building on this exact site that we are at today, and they got it about halfway done. There were 2 hurricanes, they weren't able to complete the roof, and there were a lot of issues. And so on this slide, you see kind of a timeline of the building, and unlike what Rebecca mentioned, which is that the footprint of the building is largely the same for the old Connecticut State House, our footprint changed over the years. And so this is the primary story that we share with visitors when they come to the museum about our biggest collection artifact, which is the building itself. And so on the screen, you will see kind of the footprint timeline, and that upper picture is the completed 1845 building. That structure was 3 stories, about 20,000 square feet. When I bring visitors into the space and talk about the size of that, I tell them to imagine, the grocery section of a super Walmart. So all of Florida's government is housed in this space at that point. As you can imagine, that was not adequate for a growing state. And so almost immediately there are issues where they're renting out spaces in downtown and looking at changes that are needed for the building. A few minor changes are done in the 1890s, including the addition of a small cupola at the top of the structure, which you can actually see in that upper photo there, the little tiny cupola. But the building still is inadequate. So by 1902, significant changes are needed for the building. And that 1902 footprint reflects that lower photograph and the changes that were made in that year. Governor William Sherman Jennings oversaw the project. It cost about $75,000, and the expansions to the building included a wing to the north and the south, and then also the iconic dome was added. When that exterior dome was added that you can see in that photo, there was also an interior dome that was added, which was the Rotunda area where I was earlier, where unfortunately you only were able to spend a couple of minutes with me. But we'll talk a little bit more about that space in just a moment. In addition to that interior dome and the exterior dome, some other significant changes were done in the building, including widespread electricity. So there's electrical fixtures that are added throughout the space, expansions of the House and Senate chambers, as well as steam radiators being added for heat at the time, definitely considered very fancy and appropriate for the period. and indoor plumbing. So extensive indoor plumbing was added as well. So definitely an upgrade for the legislators who were, using this space. And then on this slide, you see the transition. So as soon as 1902, the building is completed, almost again, which this is a story that is repeated throughout the history of the Capitol, the space is inadequate. So they start to run out of the space again. The Supreme Court has moved out by the 1920s into their own space. So they're no longer housed here, but there's just not enough space for the growing government here in Tallahassee and for Florida. And so they decide then to add on to the building, and they put east and west wings towards the front and the back, pull the facades kind of out, and extend the building that way. And then again, there are two more additions that occur, and the building gets to its biggest footprint in the 1940s, which is the lower picture on this slide. Now, in this photograph, you see two wings that have been added to the north and to the south. Big, big wings that really expand the building. The thing about that is that the building was expanded in two phases. So actually, there was a 1930s expansion that occurred, where one wing was built, and then because of the World War II, the second wing was not added until 1947. So there's kind of this transition period for the historic Capitol at that point where they're being added onto, but it takes a little bit of time because there isn't the manpower or the supplies, frankly, for that change to occur. Now, after 1947, what happens to Florida is that there is a huge population boom. So there's a couple of things that contribute to this boom. People start moving here in droves. One notably is the end of World War II, and the GI Bills essentially allow and encourage some returning soldiers to move back to Florida, where many of them trained and enjoyed the fine weather. Also, the expansion of the state highway system enables tourism to grow, and so industry in Florida and the economy starts to change. And so the population really starts to grow, and again, the space that is the Capitol is inadequate for government in its iteration. In fact, it's so bad, but by the 1960s, the building that you see there, while it is marble clad and looks like what you would expect a Capitol, a modern sort of Capitol to look like, it is so inadequate that there are offices above the chambers in the attics. There are winding stairs throughout the building. The building has necessary repairs that are not being done, but it's just a lot of work that needs to be done. So a decision has to be made. Like Rebecca was pointing out, you reach these periods where there's discussion, not just about what the Capitol will look like and the facility, but where it's located. And so because of that growing population that is in Florida in the 1960s, there's a dual discussion. One, do we move the Capitol? And then two, if we do not move the Capitol, do we build a new one, or do we build onto this older building? And so it's an extensive process that involves a lot of discussion. And that's what all of these next slides are about. What they decide to do ultimately is not move the Capitol from here to Orlando, for example, or South Florida. They decide to instead invest in the Tallahassee area and in state government here. And not only are they going to invest in it, they're going to spend millions of dollars expanding the footprint of the Capitol complex by building a brand new Capitol, abandoning essentially the older building. This involves a lot of discussion. They hire Edward Durrell Stone, who is a famous brutalist architect. And I will tell you this, when I give tours of the historic Capitol, when we do, curators tours in the evenings, I always sort of laugh because I become an Edward Durrell Stone apologist, essentially. He was a brutalist architect. His designs are very different than what we consider a Capitol. Remember those images I showed you earlier with the domes and the Federalist and classical architecture? Completely different than that. Picture Radio City Music Hall. Picture the Kennedy Center in DC. Poured concrete, clean lines, very angular, modern look. And that is who they hire to build the new building. So this is just one of many alternatives, what they call design alternatives for the Capitol Complex project that went through this process of review with the Capitol Planning Commission. So not only do you have an architect who has ideas about how things should look, you have a panel of people who are making the decision. So if you've ever redone your bathroom and maybe needed to pick out the sink or the mirror that was going to go up, and you had a family member that had to make the decision with you, think about how hard that was. Multiply that times 3, and then add in a famous architect. And it is a very complicated process. So we love to share these design alternatives and some of the different things that they use. And these next artifacts are a great example of the process. So not only are we talking about architecture with this story, we're talking kind of about the political and civic process and how decisions are made in government. So this is one of the models that was designed to be part of the process. This is one of the complete models. What you may notice is that there are some separate pieces, and they function in the way that you think they would. Let me show you the next slide. Now, this slide shows you sections of the model removed. And the reason for that is, again, imagine that you're swapping out the different paint colors in your kitchen. You want to sometimes hold them up, right, to see how they're going to look. And so when you have lots of options and you're spending a lot of money, you want to be sure about it. So they designed these models, which we have on display, and you can see here at the Historic Capitol, to have pieces that swap in and out, almost like little Legos. So in this particular instance, what you're seeing is the completed Capitol complex minus the kind of front section, which would include the Historic Capitol as it does today. So you're seeing the 2 office buildings. Those are the kind of front towards the top of the photo structures. So that would be the House and the Senate. And then you see the kind of little domes. Those are the 2 chambers. And then the Executive Office Tower, which is in the middle, which is where the governor's offices are, some legislators' offices, as well as the cabinet members. So when they're trying to decide how it's going to look, Edward Durell Stone has a plan. His plan essentially is to tear down the ugly and old historic Capitol building because it is going to mar the beautiful view of his building as you drive up Appalachian Parkway. And so here's just a few options of the approaches as you were driving up Appalachian Parkway. So you might see, for example, a reflecting pool, whether it be circle or rectangular. In the other option, it's just a drive up, essentially where Monroe Street and Appalachian Parkway meet, sort of like it is today. In this version as well, you see again some options for water features. Again, very modern. He wanted it to be a complement to his building, not mar the facade. At the very top, the one there is really interesting to us because what's very clear about that water feature is that it traces the footprint of the existing building and replicates it in some way, but doesn't, again, hide the facade of his building. So after all of those design discussions, ultimately what they decided to do is move forward with building the complex. But what they don't do at that point is make a decision about the historic Capitol. One of the reasons why they don't is that you can see here in this photo and more clearly later that they can need to continue to use the building for offices while the new buildings are being built. I like this photo because it shows how much clearing had to happen in order for the new Capitol to be built behind the historic Capitol. That building that you see at the very top of the photo is the Supreme Court building. And so between those two now is the Executive Office Tower, which is 22 stories above ground. This just shows you a little bit more of the new Capitol as it was being built around the historic Capitol building. As you can see, it was a very intensive project because not only were they building up, they had to build down. So the parking garages, for example, had to be put into place, and you can see the concrete pilings for it. Individuals who worked, staff members who worked in the historic Capitol at the time while this was going on around them said that the building would shake and that you could feel like the jackhammering. And we can attest to that due to the recent projects that have happened here in the last few years as they upgrade the Capitol complex again. So just imagine the kind of impact that this would have on an 1845 building inside of a 1902 building with pieces of the 20s and the 40s all attached to it, and the new structure attached as well eventually. So this is how they end up. When they finish the new Capitol, and they've moved pretty much everyone out of the old Capitol into the new structure, this is what the building looks like. The two arrows that you see there show, again, the two bridges where the old Capitol is attached to the new Capitol. So not only, we used to say that the buildings almost touched, which they did with the roof lines, but they were connected to each other. So a lot of impact on this existing building that was already in disrepair and needed a lot of love. And so again, they finished the project. They managed not to have to make a final decision. And so this is in the 1970s. And so everything really comes to a head in 1978. So they host the ribbon cutting ceremony for the new Capitol complex. Everyone is supposed to have moved out. And there's still this discussion about what are they going to do. They can't keep the building as it was with that large footprint. Because the two buildings are almost touching each other, the access to the building is not adequate. You can't get security and emergency vehicles into the courtyard area. The building is in disrepair, so something needs to happen. The people of Florida, when they heard that there was going to be the potential to lose this building, sort of the same way it happened with the old State House in Connecticut, when there's this threat to the building, the people of Florida, organizations around Florida, and legislators respond and say, no, we are not comfortable with this historic structure being torn down, and instead we need to do something to save it. And so there's a period of years where lawsuits are filed to try to stop the demolition of the building, to examine the appropriations that are being done for this complex. Like, the question at hand is whether or not you can use appropriations for demolition or for building. You know, there's some discussion about issues like that. And so things start to really come to a head. And this is one of our favorite photographs, and it kind of really explains the response to the building. This is eventual US Senator Bill Nelson, who has basically said publicly that he would put himself in front of the first bulldozer that would be sent to knock down the building. And in response to that, two other legislators sent this toy bulldozer down the aisle of the chamber, and he ceremonially put himself down in front of it. But this is the kind of discussion that is happening. So the discussion is happening in the legislature and among the citizens of Florida. They file petitions to try to save the building, and then it all kind of culminates in this, which is the Save the Historic Capitol Night, which happens on March 30th, 1978. And this was organized by Christy Kuntz, largely, who was the aide to then Secretary of State Bruce Mathers, who was also very adamantly in favor of saving the building. And on this night, they invited the citizens of Florida to come in and imagine what could be in this space. So you have the Commissioner of Agriculture is pouring orange juice in his office. You have the Comptroller, the Treasurer, he is showing off the vault that's in the building. And you have tours that are happening. There are displays that are put up. You know, could it be a museum? They start thinking about. And so they decide then to really put it forward. Petitions are draped throughout the building, showing the physical support from Floridians. And when they make the decision then to save the building, they have to decide what it is going to look like. And so that is the next decision that's then made. So all of those design processes that occur related to the building of the new Capitol then happen and are debated as it relates to the historic Capitol. So they know that they can't keep it in its 1947 footprint because that's the biggest one and it's inadequate. And then they talk about going back to 1845 because it's a smaller footprint. But they ultimately decide to restore it to 1902. And there's a few reasons for that. One is the iconic dome that you see here in the restoration architect drawings. But another significant reason is that's the last time that all three branches of Florida's government were housed in this space. Again, like the State House, we can interpret all three branches of government here because we have four restored areas for the House and the Senate, the chambers, like I'm in tonight, the governor's suite, and the Supreme Court. So that's one of the decisions. So they decide then to start restoring. And it's a restoration that's unusual because it's a restoration by demolition. This is just one of the architectural drawings from the restoration process. They are very detailed and involved. They have paint analysis, a very extensive paint schedule, down to the shade of gray. I think we have 8 grays that you can choose from in the building, and we know it for every single door, every single ledge, and I think there's 3 whites in the building. So a lot of different colors to choose from, but very, very precise preservation work. And I'll highlight 2 stories from that tonight. There's the just beginning of it, Florida's historic capital, restoration and process. A few select photos of the restoration by demolition. So unusual in that, you know, typically you think that restoring is going back to what it looked like, and it's kind of like adding back to it, which they did do, but they had to strip first. And so you see a little bit of that happening in these images here. So the restoration story is interesting because there were no known floor plans, architectural drawings for the 1902 building. So when they made the decision to go back to 1902, they knew that it was going to be an exploratory restoration process. They were literally going to have to come in, knock down walls, scrape the paint, and get into the archives and try to recreate what was in this building. And so there are a couple of really amazing preservation stories. I'm going to share 2 tonight. One relates to this photograph that you see here. This is a photograph of Commissioner McLinn. He was the Commissioner of Agriculture, and he laid in state in this building. And his family provided this photograph, this single photograph, which enabled our staircase to be reproduced to the state that it looks today from 1902. Which is like, it sets the tone for the building. You walk in the building and there's the staircase. And so we talk about that a lot too. You know, if we didn't have this historic material, you know, the building would feel completely different if we didn't have these few preservation stories that kind of came out. Another one relates to what's in these little bags. They look unassuming in that state. Those are pieces of glass. And the story related to that is, again, in the Rotunda where I was with you earlier, we have an art glass dome. And in 1902, there was also the dome. By the 1910s, because it had leaked so much in the building from the dome, which, by the way, don't ever put a dome on your building. If you're like building a house and you're thinking, oh, I really, really want to class it up, I got to put a dome on it. Don't put a dome on it. It's a very hard structure to maintain, because of the curving lines, and it's a hard envelope to seal. So maybe reconsider that. But so they put the dome on, and almost immediately it begins leaking. And there's rumors even of, you know, posters or reports where legislators are saying, you know, showers and baths, you know, courtesy of William S. Jennings, so Governor Jennings, because he puts the dome on the building. So because it was leaking, they cap it over and they remove it in the later period. When they go to do the restoration, the architects and the historic preservationists know that this dome existed, but they don't know what it looked like. So they're digging around in the building, as they're going to do. Like I said, it was an investigatory restoration process. So they're up in the attic and they look down into the walls of the building. Sometimes plans are left in the walls of the building. Well, while they're looking into the wall of the building, they discover that something is kind of like sparkly, and there's something that is like kind of shining back at them. So they come down from the attic and go to the wall and put a hole into it, and then they remove what they've seen from above. And what they had found was 100 pounds, over 100 pounds of broken stained glass. Instead of removing that construction debris from the building, the folks who destroyed the dome to replace it instead threw it in the walls of the building, and it was found during the restoration process. Because it was all of those little pieces, it had to be put back together like a puzzle. They were able to determine what the pattern was. This is one of the samples of it, the pattern, the final pattern. And then they had a reproduction made and installed. You can see this here, this is from within space, or it's being crafted, I should say. And then that's how it looks today. So if you would have looked straight up with me earlier when we were in the Rotunda, that's what you would have seen. So we're restored to 1902, and these are the restored spaces. We have thematic exhibits throughout the building, focusing on all sorts of different political history, times and moments for Florida. But these are our 4 signature spaces. Up in the corner you will see the governor's suite. Then in the opposite corner, that is the Supreme Court, the Senate chamber, and then you can see the George Washington portrait and the pink ceilings. That's where I am tonight in the House chamber. We also have a temporary exhibit space where we share exhibits like Smithsonian's Voices and Votes, Democracy in America, which was a Museum on Main Street exhibit that we were hosting earlier in the year. And this program and others are tied to that exhibit as we look at democracy and principles of democracy and sites of democracy where citizens come to participate in the process. And related to that, this final photo that you see tonight is representative of this building's frequent use as the symbolic seat of Florida's government. So while the new Capitol and working Capitol building is behind us, the tower structure, the executive office tower, many times officials use our building and the citizens of Florida use this space as the backdrop for their participation in the civic process. This is just one of the instances. This is Governor DeSantis's inauguration ceremony, and that happens here in front of this building. And so I just wanted to share that with you. But it's a space that is living and breathing. It is used by thousands of school children every year for educational reasons. It's used by citizens of Florida to participate in the civic process. And what we hope we really do is to connect those two by educating our visitors about how Florida's political processes work and to get them comfortable in the spaces here in the Capitol complex. They then return and can imagine themselves returning someday, perhaps serving as a legislator or advocating for a bill or participating in the process in some other way. And so it's really a great example of how our dual roles are tied together. So I think that is it for me. So we can stop sharing the PowerPoint and instead now start chatting with each other if anyone has any questions.
So I'm going to jump in. My name is Allie. I'm a museum educator at the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm just going to pull up a couple questions that we've collected. So the first one that stands out to me is, could each of you speak of any differences or similarities that stand out to you after hearing about the other state's Capitol building? And again, thank you so much, both Rebecca and Tiffany, for your time tonight. Both presentations were really interesting.
Well, I want to definitely get on a plane and come to Florida and check this out. So I'm hoping maybe someday I'll get down there. I think as we were talking about doing this program, a couple of things that strike me, and even more so in Tiffany's presentation, which is the whole idea of citizens caring about these historic spaces to save them, because it's part of each state's evolution, and there's something sacred about those spaces that have helped us to propel us to today. I think the fact that we both have our George Washington portraits, and of course Gilbert Stuart, I think if I remember correctly, did 3 different kinds of portraits, and we both have the Lansdowne version, which is kind of neat. And I think also we were talking a little bit about the fact that, and Tiffany, that at your Capitol, that there was actually kind of the precursor of a natural history museum, which I'll let you speak about, but which was really amazing, because I had always thought, oh, well, Stuart's museum is so unique and everything. And then we were talking, and it seems to be something that's fairly common amongst old capitals. And to me, it's always seemed to be part of the state's efforts to educate and give citizens opportunity. But I'll let you talk about that.
Yes, I didn't include the photos tonight, but there are some photos on Florida Memory that show the museum that you're referring to. It was, I think, housed here between 1911 and maybe 1920. But the collection that was on display is a natural history collection that was from the Florida Geologic Survey, essentially, that collection. And then it became, as far as we know, part of the Museum of Natural History, which is in Gainesville, and was like the precursor to kind of the main state collection. And so you see in the photo everything you would imagine, like specimen jars and books to be looked at, and so it's very similar to the one that you had as well. So I guess they knew in 1911 what we were going to become, and so they just laid the groundwork and set us up for museum life.
So we can take just a couple more questions. Thank you both for your answers. This is a good one. What is your favorite room in your Capitol building?
I'll go first on that one. 100%. It's the Rotunda, because the space with the dome, and there are days when the sun shines in from the windows from above and hit the dome, and then they reflect the colors onto the linoleum floor in the building, and which is unusual too. So many weird things to talk about. The linoleum floor, and it's just beautiful and quiet, and it feels reverent in here, and so that's my favorite space.
I would have to say, for me, my favorite space is the Senate chamber, because I love federal style. And, I think about the fact in that space that, that was our first kind of national style. And so it was the process of becoming Americans. I also happen to really like yellow for color of a room. And I love the portrait of George Washington. And I think similar to what you just said, Tiffany, when the sun comes in to that space, it's just really beautiful. And, that is a room that really showcases how things change over time and the evolution of where we started with here in Connecticut, where, we kept our same constitution that existed before the revolution, just crossed out mentioning the king, and kept that state constitution until 1818. And at that point, the governor's council became the Senate. The governor got a little more power, and the governor's council had met in private. It was at that time that a railing was added so that we, the people, could come and hear what the Senate was meeting about. So I really enjoy that space.
I was going to say, I love that the yellow is so cheery and unexpected. And I think that's the fun thing too about our building, because we have this baby blue and this kind of pink color, and people think it's associated with Florida, but it's because it was late Victorian, patriotic colors, but it's just, I think, unexpected, and you think it's going to be super serious, because it is a very serious space and very important things happen here, but like the yellow cheery chamber, it's exciting. It's a space with a lot of life, and so I think the colors reflect that.
And I think it's really interesting too, as you were talking about the restoration of the building. I think I think people who maybe aren't as intimately involved with historic preservation don't realize how many choices there are to be made when you're doing a restoration. If we were doing a restoration in 2021, our focus, our mission with the Connecticut Democracy Center is civics and history. So maybe we wouldn't show so much of the City Hall period, and we'd focus just on the state government. But it was really interesting, as you were speaking, to hear about some of the choices that were made, even about what time period do you go back to and why do you do that? And I think that's really, I think when visitors come, they find it very interesting, because it's not quite so oh, yes, we're going to do this, but there are a lot of choices as you go through the whole process.
And it's ongoing. That's the other thing that we talk about all the time, is that, and actually this is perfect because Rotunda Rendezvous is part of that, is that it's not that you find a building, it's in disrepair, you decide to save it, you repair it and restore it, and you're done. It's no, if you want to use the space, you have to be continually evaluating how you use it, making sure that it's, kept in repair, and also, continue to use it, because the worst thing you could do is mothball it and not let anyone in, and so that's the thing. It's restoration and preservation really is these moments where we gather and give the space purpose, I think. And yeah, you have to keep working at it. it's not just you cut the ribbon and it's over. It's every single day, making choices, like you said, to use the space, repair the space, or find new use for it. So.
And I think you bring up a really important point, Tiffany, which is the fact that democracy is participatory. And, for us, we're considered part of the state capitol complex, although we're not as close as your building is to the current one. There's a little bit of a jaunt through Bushnell Park. But, here we do public programs and school programs that focus on the three branches of state government. We really focus on that. And we're still used by people when there are protests or, wanting to celebrate something. People can rent the building, things like that. And I think, it's so important for these spaces to continue to be used because, they really reflect the need for citizens to be engaged in their government and their democracy, just as and so I think it really gives our buildings that are historic, that can speak to things that have happened in the past, but hopefully encourage people to participate in the future.
Well, and I think they're both very physical representations of citizens participating in the process by advocating for the saving of these structures. So, I mean, just at the very basic level, they represent that by existing.
That's really true. Here in Connecticut, none of the New Haven capitals exist. So this is the oldest existing capital in our state.
The one thing I will say that we're very lucky about with the restoration process and actually the way that they, used the building over the years is that as they added on, they saved that core structure. So when we have projects every so often, that structure is revealed to us and we have the opportunity to gather information or share it with the public. And so one of the things we were able to do as part of a project a few years ago is to expose the 1845 brick and be able to make a direct and tangible connection to the enslaved artisans who worked on the building, because it was built in the 1845, that core part of the building. And so we're able through research and documents to tie people to this building, and it's just a really significant part of Tallahassee's history and this history that we have the opportunity to interpret tangibly because of the way the building was, adapted over the years. And so that's been really incredible. Like you said, it's amazing to have it, the artifact.
And I think the other thing that struck me, because we have something similar in Connecticut, Hartford is pretty much in the center of our state, not directly, but it's not our biggest city. That would be Bridgeport. And I think it's interesting to see the choices made for where to have a capital, and that you also in Florida went through that process of, do we really want to have it in that city? Because P.T. Barnum, who is known for many things, including his circus, but also he served as a legislator in the 1800s, mid 1800s. But he wanted, when they were talking about moving the capital, he nominated his adopted hometown of Bridgeport, that he thought it should be moved there, which he obviously didn't win that one, but.
It's a discussion we continue to have today. So it's certainly historically relevant in a thread that we can follow. So it's really very interesting to look at the historic and listen to the historic, arguments, and then hear similar arguments today. So a lot of choices have to be made, and that's part of the process too, right? How do you make, like you said, with the design choices, but when you're making government decisions on behalf of thousands and millions of people, how do you make the right decisions? And there's a lot of information and a lot of people and a lot of voices that participate. And so how do you accommodate all of those?
Well, thank you both so much. You definitely hit on a couple other topics that were brought up in some of the questions, specifically how both Tallahassee and Hartford came to be the capitals. And Tiffany, I loved what you said about the importance of historic preservation and ongoing historic preservation, and the importance of keeping the old buildings and also using them in different ways. Rebecca, do you want to say a few words?
Just that it's really delightful to get to celebrate Historic Preservation Month. We do, I kind of chuckled, Tiffany, when you were talking about those visitors who are trying to visit all 50 state capitals. And I loved the image that you shared because it, once you kind of get into it, it is really fun to see the similarities and differences. And I'm dying to see your new capital because that's so different from my experience with some of the capitals that I've seen. But these are really historic preservation is really an important thing because these spaces speak to the people of the past and choices and evolution and where we got to where we are today. And they're also really magnificent structures to walk through. And I certainly feel privileged to come to the old State House as part of my work and get to interpret such a fabulous building. And I just want to say thank you for inviting us to be part of the room. It's been delightful.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and it's so fun to see other people's spaces and experience them together. And thank you for doing it. I really enjoyed it.
I was muted, but I was just going to say thank you both, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. We look forward to having more programs in the future, and thank you.
And please fill out your survey.
Yes.
Thank you.